The December wind cut across the Kansas plains like a knife through butter, sending snow devils dancing across the frozen fields. Sarah Brennan watched from beneath the old well's wooden cover as her husband Thomas cranked the windlass, lowering their youngest daughter Emma back down into their hidden world. The child clutched a tin lantern, its warm glow disappearing into the earth like a falling star. "Clear above," Thomas whispered, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "No riders on the road." Sarah nodded and helped him ease the round plank cover back into place. To anyone passing by, this looked like nothing more than an abandoned well on foreclosed property. Exactly what they needed the world to believe. The bank had seized everything. Their farmhouse, their barn, the 160 acres Thomas had proved up over 7 hard years. But they hadn't found the family's most valuable asset, hidden 20 feet beneath the frozen ground. It had started 4 months earlier, in late August, when Thomas returned from town with news that made Sarah's blood run cold. The bank was calling in loans across 3 counties. The crop failures of the previous 2 seasons had left them vulnerable, and the banker, a cold-eyed man named Hutchins, had made it clear the Brennans would lose everything by winter. That night, Thomas had paced their modest farmhouse until nearly dawn. "The old well," he'd finally said. "The one that went dry 5 years back." Sarah had looked at him as if he'd lost his mind, but as he explained his plan, she began to understand. The well shaft was sound, lined with fitted stone down to 30 feet, where it met bedrock. The water table had dropped during the drought, leaving the bottom dry as dust. But more importantly, the base of the well opened into a natural cavity in the limestone, a space Thomas had discovered years ago when he'd gone down to investigate the water loss. "We can't live in a hole in the ground," Sarah had protested, thinking of their 3 children. "We can't live with nothing at all," Thomas had countered. "And it won't be just a hole. Give me time, and I'll make it livable." They'd had exactly 14 weeks before the bank's deadline. Thomas and his 2 older boys, James and Michael, had worked in shifts, always with someone on watch. They'd lowered timber supports, planks, tools, and supplies down the well shaft under cover of darkness. Thomas had been a miner before he'd homesteaded, and those hard-learned skills now became their salvation. The natural cavity at the well's base had been perhaps 10 feet across and 6 feet high, barely enough to turn around in. But Thomas had carefully excavated, following the limestone seam, creating a chamber roughly 15 feet long and 12 feet wide. He'd shored every inch with salvaged timber, creating a framework of beams and joists that would support the earth above. The walls he'd lined with stacked fieldstone, mortared with clay from the creek bed, mixed with dried grass. The ceiling was perhaps the most ingenious part. Thomas had constructed it from overlapping planks, then covered it with canvas they'd waterproofed using rendered animal fat. Above that went a layer of stones, then packed earth, creating insulation and ensuring that any sound from below would be muffled. The well shaft itself served as their chimney, ventilation, and sole entrance. For the stove, Thomas had bartered away his pocket watch for a small cast-iron model, the kind drovers used in their chuck wagons. It was barely 2 feet tall and 18 inches square, but it could burn wood or dried buffalo chips with remarkable efficiency. The real challenge had been the stovepipe. Running a metal pipe straight up the well shaft would have been visible from above, a dead giveaway. Instead, Thomas had created a double wall system. The stovepipe ran up through a carefully constructed channel along the inside of the well's stone lining, hidden from view. The smoke dispersed into the well shaft about 15 feet up, where a series of baffles made from thin stone slabs directed it to drift upward naturally. On cold days, the warm smoke simply became part of the well's air column, invisible against the winter sky. They burned only the driest wood, selected for minimal smoke, and never during the day when a wisp might be spotted against the blue. The ladder down was another Thomas innovation. Rather than a permanent fixture, he'd created a rope ladder with wooden rungs that could be pulled up from below and hidden. During the day, they left it down, but hung a heavy canvas curtain across the shaft at the bottom, creating an airlock of sorts that helped maintain the chamber's warmth and muffled any sound. For light, they relied on 3 sources: candles made from rendered beef tallow, a single kerosene lantern they used sparingly, and the stove itself when its iron door was cracked open. Sarah had learned to work in the dimness, her eyes adjusting to the perpetual twilight of their underground home. The children had proven even more adaptable, playing quiet games in the amber glow, their voices hushed by habit. Sleeping arrangements had required creative thinking. Thomas had built narrow bunks along one wall, stacked 2 high. The lower bunks held James and Michael, now 16 and 14 respectively. The upper bunks held 8-year-old Emma and the family's supplies. Thomas and Sarah shared a wider bed on the opposite wall, constructed from planks and topped with a corn husk mattress. Wool blankets, carefully packed and protected from moisture, provided warmth. The chamber's temperature remained remarkably stable, cold by indoor standards at perhaps 50 degrees, but far better than the brutal freeze above ground. The sleeping area was separated from the living space by a simple curtain Sarah had sewn from feed sacks. This gave the family some small measure of privacy and helped contain the warmth from the stove in the main chamber during the coldest hours. Food storage had been their primary focus during the preparation months. While Thomas worked on the structure, Sarah and the children had been preserving, drying, and storing. Root vegetables went into bins lined with sand: potatoes, turnips, carrots, and onions. They'd brought down 3 barrels, one of salt pork, one of dried beans, and one containing their precious flour, carefully sealed against moisture. Apples, sliced thin and dried, hung in cloth bags from the ceiling beams. Jerked venison, made from the deer Thomas had taken in October, occupied another bag. They had hardtack, dried corn, and even a small quantity of coffee, worth its weight in gold and rationed carefully. Water was drawn from a spring a quarter-mile distant. Every 3 days, after dark, Thomas or one of the boys would make the journey, returning with 2 heavy buckets. They'd discovered that the natural coolness of the chamber kept the water fresh for days. Every drop was precious. Washing was minimal. Cooking water was reused for cleaning. And they'd learned to make a single bucket last where previously they might have used 3. Cooking itself was an exercise in efficiency and patience. The small stove could accommodate only 1 pot at a time. Sarah had learned to create 1-pot meals that could simmer slowly: beans with salt pork and dried onions, stews made from jerked meat and whatever vegetables they could spare, porridge from cracked corn or oats. The stove's heat was too valuable to waste. Whenever something cooked, other tasks were arranged around it. Wet clothing was dried on a line near the stovepipe. Water was warmed for washing faces and hands. The kettle was nearly always present, providing hot water for coffee or tea made from wild mint they'd gathered and dried. Bread was a luxury now. Baking required heating the stove hotter than usual, consuming precious fuel and creating more smoke than was wise. Perhaps once a week, Sarah would make a small loaf or a pan of cornbread, timing it for the coldest days when smoke would be least visible. The smell of baking bread in their underground home was a reminder of normalcy, a sensory bridge to the life they'd known. The most delicate challenge had been sanitation. Thomas had extended a small side chamber, barely 5 feet deep and 3 feet wide, accessed through a low opening covered by a wooden door. This served as their necessary room. He'd dug down another 4 feet and filled it with alternating layers of sand and ashes from the stove, creating a primitive but effective cesspit. A wooden seat, carefully smoothed to prevent splinters, was positioned over the hole. After each use, a handful of wood ash was sprinkled down, controlling odor and breaking down waste. Torn newspaper and old catalog pages served for cleaning. Once a week, Thomas would add a fresh layer of sand and ash. He'd calculated that the system would last them through the winter, and come spring, God willing, they'd no longer need it. For privacy during these moments, the family had established strict protocols. A wooden peg on the door indicated occupancy. No one spoke of it, but everyone understood. In such close quarters, dignity required deliberate effort. Washing was similarly regimented. A basin of warm water, rationed carefully, allowed for face and hands each morning. Once weekly, each family member got a more thorough wash with a wet cloth, done in turns behind the privacy curtain. Sarah had cut their homemade lye soap into small pieces, making each bar last. Hair washing was reserved for every other week, and they'd learned to live with the close human smell of their confined space, overlaid with wood smoke, cooking, and earth. Laundry presented its own puzzle. They couldn't hang washing outside where it might be seen. Instead, clothes were worn longer between washings, and when washing was necessary, items were done in small batches in a bucket of heated water with minimal soap. The wrung-out garments were then hung near the stovepipe, where they dried slowly over a day or two. They'd brought down only essential clothing, and each person now owned perhaps 3 changes of garments, where once they'd had wardrobes. The psychological challenges of their confinement were perhaps harder than the physical ones. James and Michael, young men ready to test themselves against the world, found the forced inactivity maddening. Thomas set them to tasks, carving new spoons from wood, braiding rope, mending harnesses they'd saved. Anything to keep their hands busy and minds occupied. He taught them chess using pieces he'd carved from wood, the board drawn on a plank with charcoal. Emma was too young to fully grasp their danger, but old enough to miss running in the sunshine. Sarah created lessons for her, teaching letters and numbers by lantern light, making a game of it. The child had a slate and a few precious pieces of chalk, and she practiced writing her name over and over. The scratch of chalk on slate, a constant, soft rhythm in their burrow. Sarah herself fought the weight of their circumstances by maintaining routine. She woke the family at what she judged to be dawn, though they couldn't see the sun. Meals were served at regular times. The sleeping area was kept tidy. These small assertions of normalcy helped hold the darkness at bay, both literal and metaphorical. Thomas bore the heaviest burden. This had been his plan, his solution. The safety of his family rested on the soundness of his engineering and the sustainability of their supplies. He climbed the ladder every evening after full dark, moving the well cover aside just enough to scan the horizon. Sometimes he saw lantern light from distant farms. Twice he'd spotted riders on the road and had frozen, barely breathing, until they passed. The bank had posted a man in their old farmhouse for the first 3 weeks, probably hoping the Brennans would attempt to return. Thomas had watched from the well mouth as smoke rose from his own chimney, as strangers walked through his door. It had required all his self-control not to rage, but Sarah's hand on his shoulder reminded him what mattered. The man was gone now. The house stood empty, gradually succumbing to winter and neglect. Hutchins had put the property up for sale, but in these hard times, buyers were scarce. Thomas heard through the secret grapevine, a sympathetic merchant in town who left coded messages under a stone near the spring, that the bank was growing frustrated. They wanted to make an example of the Brennans, to show other defaulters that you couldn't simply disappear and escape your debts. Men had been asking questions in town. Had anyone seen the family? Where might they have gone? The Brennan sympathizers, and there were more than a few, claimed ignorance. The family had vanished like smoke, some said. Probably went to Missouri, others suggested, or maybe California. The stories contradicted each other, which was perfect. In the absence of facts, speculation flourished, and the truth remained buried along with the family who lived it. Thomas had a plan for spring. A claim jumper 2 counties over had offered to buy the farm through an intermediary for pennies on the dollar, but enough to satisfy the bank and perhaps leave a small stake. The Brennans would emerge, legally re-established elsewhere with new names and a fresh start. It was fraud, technically, but Thomas had made his peace with that. The banks had committed their own frauds, calling in loans before their time, seizing property worth far more than the debts owed. If the law wouldn't protect his family, he'd protect them himself. But that was spring, and spring was still months away. Now, in the deep of December, their world was the chamber, the ladder, the stove, and each other. One evening, as Sarah portioned out their supper, a stew of dried beans, reconstituted with water and flavored with a small piece of salt pork, a few dried onions, and a pinch of their dwindling salt, Emma asked the question that had been haunting them all. "Pa, when can we go home?" Thomas looked at his daughter, her face solemn in the lamplight, and felt his heart contract. This burrow was home now, would be for months to come, but he couldn't tell her that, not directly. "Well, little bird," he said, using his pet name for her, "we're in a kind of long winter sleep, like the bears do. Come spring, when the world wakes up, we'll wake up too. We'll find a place with sunshine and fresh air and room to run." "But I want our old home," Emma said, and her lower lip trembled. Sarah intervened, wrapping an arm around the child. "Sometimes the old homes aren't ours anymore, sweetheart, but we'll make a new one, and it'll be good. Better even, because we'll know how precious it is." James, sitting on his bunk and pretending to read a water-damaged book by lamplight, spoke up. "It's an adventure, Emma, like the explorers in your stories. We're like Lewis and Clark, making our own way. Except we're going down instead of west," Michael added with a grin, trying to lighten the mood. Emma considered this, her child's mind working through the comparison. "Are we discovering new territory?" "We're discovering what we're made of," Thomas said quietly, "and that's worth knowing." The conversation drifted to other topics. Michael's elaborate plans for a treehouse he'd build someday, Sarah's memories of her grandmother's farm in Pennsylvania, James's questions about mining and whether Thomas thought there might be gold in the limestone. They were stories to pass the time, dreams to keep hope alive. Later, after the children were abed and the lamp turned low, Thomas and Sarah lay together in their narrow bunk, speaking in whispers. "We have enough food," Sarah said. It was a statement and a question. "Through February, certainly," Thomas replied. "Into March if we're careful. The spring will be early, or it won't. Either way, we'll manage." "And if someone finds us before then?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. They'd discussed this possibility, but never in detail. "There's the hunting rifle and the revolver, hidden in the supply bunker. But it won't come to that. We're ghosts, Sarah. People don't find ghosts. She wanted to believe him. Most days, she did. But in the deep night, listening to the earth settling around them, feeling the weight of all that stone and soil above, doubt crept in like cold water through a cracked foundation. "The children are managing better than I dared hope," she said, changing the subject. "They're Brennans," Thomas said with quiet pride. "We're a tough breed." "They're also scared. Emma has nightmares. James pretends to read but just stares at the same page. Michael counts the boards in the ceiling. I've watched him do it a dozen times." "And what do you do, Sarah Brennan, when the walls close in?" She thought about it. "I cook. I measure flour and water. I stir the pot. I keep my hands busy. And I think about the garden I'll plant when we have land again. Tomatoes and squash and green beans. Herbs in a sunny window. Flowers, Thomas. I dream about flowers." He pulled her closer. "You'll have them. All of them. I promise you." It was a promise he had no right to make, but she let him make it anyway, because sometimes what you needed wasn't truth, but hope. And in their buried world, hope was the most precious resource of all. The winter deepened. Snow piled against the well curb above, helping to insulate and hide them. Christmas came and went, marked only by Sarah saving enough sugar and dried apples to make a small cake, and Thomas producing a carved wooden doll he'd made in secret for Emma. The boys received new leather belts, stitched by Sarah from scraps. It wasn't much, but Emma clutched her doll as if it were made of gold, and the boys wore their belts with visible pride. On New Year's Eve, they sang hymns together, their voices soft in the earthen chamber. "Amazing Grace," and "Rock of Ages," and "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing." The songs connected them to the world above, to the community they'd lost, to the faith that sustained them. When they finished, the silence seemed deeper, but somehow less oppressive. January brought brutal cold above ground. Thomas, checking the thermometer he kept hidden near the well mouth, saw readings of 15 and 20 below zero. But in their burrow, the temperature held steady at around 45 degrees. The earth itself was their insulation, their protection. The stove's small fire was enough to keep them comfortable, if not warm, and they wore layers of clothing even indoors. They developed a rhythm, a routine that made the days bearable. Morning began with Thomas lighting the stove and heating water. Sarah prepared breakfast while the children did their morning washing. After eating, there were lessons for Emma, chores for the boys, mending and preparation for Sarah, and maintenance checks for Thomas. Midday brought a light meal and quiet time. Afternoons were for reading aloud, games, carving, sewing, and whatever small tasks needed doing. Evening brought supper, conversation, and eventually sleep. It was monotonous, but monotony was survival. Each day they stayed hidden was a day closer to spring, to freedom, to the life they'd rebuild. And slowly, impossibly, the days began to lengthen. Thomas noticed it first in his evening observations. The light lasted a bit longer. The stars appeared a few minutes later. Winter's back was still strong, but spring was gathering somewhere beyond the horizon. They'd made it this far. They'd survived foreclosure, loss, and the brutal necessity of living like rabbits in a burrow. They'd maintained their dignity, their family bonds, and their hope. The bank had taken their house and land, but it hadn't broken them. The harsh reality of their situation crystallized one afternoon in late January when the stove began to smoke more than usual. Thomas spent an anxious hour investigating, eventually discovering that ice had formed in the upper portion of the well shaft, partially blocking the airflow. He had to climb up in the bitter cold, chip away the ice with a chisel, and hope no one spotted him working. The incident reminded them all how precarious their situation remained. One wrong move, one piece of bad luck, and everything could unravel. But they adapted, as they'd been adapting since August. Thomas began checking the well shaft every few days, preventing ice buildup before it became dangerous. The boys took turns helping him, learning skills they'd need if they ever had to manage on their own. Emma, meanwhile, had become remarkably adept at moving through the cramped space without bumping into things, her small size an advantage in the confined quarters. The food supplies dwindled as predicted. Sarah became increasingly creative with their meals, making thin soups stretch for 2 days, grinding the hardtack into crumbs to extend the flour, picking through the dried beans to find every last one. The boys were constantly hungry, their growing bodies demanding more than the rations could provide. But no one complained. They understood the mathematics of survival. In early February, Thomas made a dangerous nighttime trip to the abandoned farmhouse. He'd spotted through the well opening that snow had collapsed part of the barn roof, and he hoped to salvage some of the tools and supplies he'd been forced to leave behind. He returned 3 hours later, shaking with cold, but carrying a sack of seed corn they'd stored in the barn loft, a coil of good rope, and, most precious of all, a tin of rendered lard that would supplement their cooking fat for weeks. Close call, he admitted to Sarah as he warmed himself by the stove. Thought I heard voices near the road. Might have been the wind, might not have been. We'll need to be even more careful now. Despite the hardships, there were moments of unexpected grace. Michael taught Emma a clapping game their mother had taught him years ago, and the sound of the child's laughter in the dim chamber was like birdsong. James discovered he had a talent for storytelling, spinning elaborate tales of adventure that transported them all beyond their earthen walls. Sarah and Thomas, thrown together in the closest of quarters, found their bond deepening in ways they hadn't anticipated, their partnership refined by shared adversity into something stronger than mere affection. The turning point came in mid-February. Thomas emerged one evening to find the air noticeably warmer, the snow beginning to soften. It was still winter, still cold, but the iron grip of the deep freeze had loosened. He returned below with the news, and Sarah allowed herself a small smile. 6 more weeks, she said. Maybe 8. We can do that. We can do anything, Thomas replied. And for the first time in months, he sounded like he truly believed it. The contact with their ally in town brought word in late February that Hutchins had finally given up actively searching for them. The property sale was proceeding, and the bank seemed content to write off the family as disappeared. This didn't mean they were safe. If discovered, they'd still face consequences, but the active threat had diminished. The news brought a palpable shift in the chamber's atmosphere. Shoulders that had been hunched for months began to straighten. Conversations became more animated, looking forward rather than simply enduring. Even the air seemed easier to breathe, though nothing physical had changed. As February turned to March, the underground chamber began to feel less like a tomb and more like a cocoon. They were changing in here, becoming something different from what they'd been. The soft farm family that had lived in the comfortable farmhouse was gone. In its place was something harder, more resilient, forged in darkness and deprivation. Emma could read now, sounding out words from the few books they had. James and Michael had learned patience and discipline beyond their years. Sarah had discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, and Thomas had proven that his unconventional solution, born of desperation and mining experience, could actually work. On the 1st of March, Thomas climbed up for his evening check and found the well mouth surrounded by standing water. The ground was thawing. Spring was truly coming. He descended quickly and gathered the family. "Another 3 weeks," he told them, "4 at most. Then we start our new life." The final weeks were the hardest, not because conditions worsened, but because anticipation made time crawl. They were so close to freedom that the confinement became almost unbearable. But they held steady, maintaining the discipline that had sustained them through the darkest months. On March 20th, the spring equinox, Thomas made his decision. The ground had thawed enough. The deal for the property was complete. The time had come. They packed in careful silence, taking only what they could carry. The chamber that had sheltered them through the winter would remain, a secret testimony to their endurance. Perhaps someday, years hence, someone would discover it and wonder at the careful construction, the stove, the bunks. They'd never know the story of the family who had lived there, hidden from the world. Just before dawn on March 21st, the Brennans climbed the ladder one final time. Thomas went first, checking to ensure the coast was clear. Then Sarah, then the children, each emerging into the pre-dawn darkness like creatures from a long hibernation. The air smelled different, alive with the scent of wet earth and growing things. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, stars fading as the world prepared for sunrise. They stood together beside the old well, 5 figures in worn clothing, thinner than they'd been, harder, transformed. "Which way, Pa?" James asked. Thomas pointed west, toward where their contact had arranged for a wagon to meet them. "That way, to our new beginning." They walked away as the sun rose, leaving behind the well, the chamber, the winter of their greatest trial. The morning light touched their faces, warm and real, and Emma laughed, a pure, joyful sound that carried across the awakening plains. Behind them, the well stood silent and unremarkable, keeping its secrets. To any casual observer, it was just an old, dry well on abandoned property, nothing special, nothing to see. But the Brennans knew different. They carried with them the knowledge of what they'd survived, and that knowledge would shape everything that came after. They'd been tested by circumstance and had emerged unbroken. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, hardened by winter, strengthened by darkness, and ready for the light.